Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 289 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. One of the major aims of this podcast is not just to go over the well-known and well-beloved figures of medieval history, although that is always a great time, but it's also to bring attention to those people who have tended to be on the sidelines of historical narratives that have come down to us through the centuries. It seems to me that the better we can understand these people and to try to get close to their lived experiences, the better we can understand the period as a whole. So for this episode, we're heading to a kingdom nestled in the heart of Scandinavia to learn about the lives of its early queens. This week, I spoke with Dr. Caroline Wilhelmsson about the royal women of Sweden. Caroline is an assistant curator at the Tower of London, where she works on the history and development of the Waterloo Barracks and the Royal Fusilier Museum. Her medieval work focuses on the politics of early Sweden, including her new book, The Queens and Royal Women of Sweden, circa 970 to 1330, Their Lives, Power, and Legacy. Our conversation on how a woman became a queen in Sweden, how she exercised her power, and how the role of queenship changed over time is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Caroline, to talk about the royal women of Sweden. You're a trailblazer in this field, and I am so happy to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you.
So in your book, you mentioned that nobody has talked about these royal women in Sweden in either Swedish or English. What's happening here?
What's happening is that women have traditionally been seen as kind of secondary accessories to kingship and to male power in general. You do see them in scholarship, but they're just mentioned. You'll get one line if you're lucky, maybe a footnote, and it's usually as part of a biography or a chapter or a bigger piece about a man. It's not, focusing on that particular woman. My book was quite a bit of a novelty in that I decided to focus on these women and to actually dig a bit deeper into their lives and to their biographies as far as feasible. Because, of course, there's quite a few of them for whom we have no precise information because, it's so old. So I did reuse a lot of existing scholarship and existing information. It's more about compiling it in just one place and really putting the emphasis on these women. And I would say, though, that, I'm part of a new generation of scholars. It's becoming more and more common to talk about women. I mean, the book was published as part of a series that focuses on royal women all over the world and throughout history. So while my book was a first in that particular very niche field of Swedish queens, it is very much part of a much bigger trend kind of all over academia at the moment.
Yes. And before we turned on the microphones, we were talking about this is part of the series that Matthew Firth is part of. So people who are interested in that episode in January, this is part of the same series covering royal women. And I think it's such an important series. And both of you had lots of challenges putting together these biographies, in part because of the nature of the sources and what things were like in Sweden at the beginning of the period that you're studying. So can you give us a sense of what it's like for just royalty in Sweden at this time? Because it's not as easy to trace as people might think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The book starts in the 10th century. So bang on in the middle of the Viking Age. And so Sweden is not really a thing yet. It's definitely not a state. That really doesn't come into play before the 16th century, or it's not in my realm, not my field at all. It's not a kingdom either. It's not just one unit. It's a bunch of different petty kingdoms. That's what we call. Some people used to use the word tribes. That's not really a thing anymore. But that gives you an idea of these kind of small little groups with a chief, with a local sort of elite. I don't want to use the word aristocracy because it's not quite the system yet. But so all of these people kind of coexist in this Scandinavian context. So they do have quite a lot of things in common in terms of culture, in terms of language. Obviously they're using the same weapons. They kind of have the same technology. So, that will be the Vikings you're thinking of when you're watching TV or whatever. But they are actually quite isolated. In Sweden, you have a lot of very dense forest. I mean, still today, but it was even worse back then. Communication routes and networks are not that well developed yet. And so you don't have central kingship like you do in other places in Europe. You can't compare with like England or France or any of these places. And so that makes it a bit complicated already to kind of define what is a king, right? So are we just talking about like a local chief, or are we talking about like a dynasty, or like, how does it work?
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously, what is a queen? Because it's even less well defined. And at that time, warriors, men usually have plenty of partners, concubines, possibly legal wives as well, several wives, because we don't have Christianity yet. It's not, in Sweden, it's not a thing yet. We've heard of missionaries, we kind of know the concept, but Christianity doesn't really spread in earnest before like the 12th century, something like that. It's really quite late, even compared to Denmark and Norway. So the Vikings obviously had lots of contacts with the rest of Europe. So they are aware of what is happening outside of Scandinavia, how things are being run, the aristocracy, all these things. They know that, but obviously they're still kind of existing in their own little prehistoric system, if you want to use the word prehistoric as in pre-written sources, which is how we use it in Sweden. And so you've got a weird mix of kind of like archaic practices and the beginning of like continental customs coming in. So it's a mess, basically, as you might, gather from me trying to explain the situation. I knew when I, decided to start in the 10th century, I knew that the first part of the book was going to be a little bit problematic from that perspective. But I did want to tackle the issue because the whole point is that a lot of people have avoided the issue because it is messy. Mm-hmm. And so we've got a massive gap in our knowledge and in scholarship for that period, because people in general kind of prefer to deal with the 12th century onwards, because that's when we start having really more elaborate written sources and records of all kinds.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what we have in terms of sources for that period, so we do have plenty of records written from outside of Sweden. So a lot of clerics, a lot of priests, monks, these kind of the people who wrote basically at the time, from Germany mainly, writing about what they are seeing and hearing about Sweden. Usually these people never went to Sweden, so they start writing about like Cyclops and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, you definitely didn't go. These sources obviously are most of the sources we've got for that period, but they're also very interesting because they kind of tell us how Sweden was seen from a continental perspective and how they fit within that European context and political context. Mm-hmm. So it is very important. But in terms of indigenous sources, we've got very few. So we've got runestones, which are pretty much useless when it comes to queenship because they don't really talk about queens. Very useful for talking about women in general, though. So they're still very valuable source for gender studies, but I didn't use them as much as I would have wanted to as part of the book. And then it's just archaeology, really.
Yes. So how does someone get to be a king at this point? Because it's not the same sort of linear way that people are doing this later. And then how does someone get to be a queen? Based on the sketchy sources that we have from the earliest time, what does it look like it's happening?
In terms of becoming a king, you get chosen. So it's elective, and it's actually, the monarchy in Sweden is elective for quite a few centuries after that. You only get into the, linear succession kind of from the 14th century onward. But that's a medieval thing in general. Like in a lot of different countries, it's actually elective. And I think a lot of people kind of forget about that. Being the son of a king did not mean that you were going to inherit the throne. There's the kind of things that you see in the sagas. That's a theme that comes back quite a lot. You've got to prove yourself. You've got to prove that you are a good leader. So you've got all these different criteria kind of changing a little bit depending on, what period we're looking at and what area. But, you've got to be brave and you've got to be stronger. You need to have lots of women around you to prove that you're the best and this kind of stuff. In Sweden, we do have quite an emphasis as well on land ownership. But I mean, it kind of feeds into that idea that you've got to be the strongest anyway. It's either physical or economical, but basically it's kind of always that idea. You need to have more resources than your neighbor. And I mean, obviously there's a reason for that as well, right? It does mean that you can protect your village or whatever better as well. So we do get a lot of that. In many cases, we're not too sure where these people actually came from. But it usually is like long lines of warriors, so it's kind of always the same. And you usually have like religious connotations as well. So they're always claiming some vague godly ancestry or trying to pull these kind of strings just to kind of reaffirm their claim to power. And as you progress through history, though, and through the book, you start seeing more and more an emphasis on politics, political power, economic power, religious power as well. It kind of gets more and more continental from that perspective. Basically, it follows the decline of the Viking Age as well. Raiding and all these things, it kind of starts getting out of fashion in like the 11th century or something like that. People say 1066. It's not quite true, obviously. It's quite arbitrary. It keeps going for a while. But yeah, so that's how you become a king. And then as to how do you become a queen, well, usually you get kidnapped. Basically, that's what we see in the sources. We suppose, of course, that some of these unions were more peaceful, but that's not the ones you're going to talk about in the sources for obvious reasons. You're going to talk about the stuff that makes you look very strong or that makes you look very bad, like, oh, that guy, he kidnapped so many women. And it's written by a guy from Germany, so you're not actually sure whether it's true or not. But so usually women are chosen from the ranks of your enemies because it's a way of striking an alliance, basically. Yeah, women are just used as diplomatic tools. Yes, absolutely. It's grim. And that's usually what happens. And every time you've got a battle, like a really big one, you'll get another woman. And this kind of, just carries on like that. And we don't know how they choose which one is the main wife. Probably has to do with ancestry, which one is the highest in terms of social status. Simple as that. I would like to think that sometimes they did really fall in love, but I'm not sure. So.
Yes, I'm with you there. Like you're hoping that it's not all grim and tragic, but it's not looking good. But you're mentioning in the book that you can have several wives, as you're saying, or concubines, or however we want to define this, which is very difficult to do at this moment. And there isn't a hierarchy in terms of their children, except for possibly, and maybe later, this has to do with the religious wedding or social status. Yep. But this is not quite unique, but it is special to Sweden in that there doesn't seem to be the same type of hierarchy as there is in other cultures that have this many concubines and wives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is very interesting. A lot of people that I've been talking to kind of spontaneously compare with China, for example, that is like so stratified with that concubine that is kind of the head of that household, and that one is doing this. You don't seem to have that in Sweden. At least it doesn't appear in the sources. And it very much looks like if you are a child of a chief, then that's it. You're one of his kids. And then, you kind of have the same rights as everybody else. It's true that it is very much linked to what we define as a union as well. Because in the 12th century and for most of the 11th century, we don't have any evidence that they actually got married as in what marriage is in canon law, like, the kind of religious Christian marriage. It's not really a thing. And I mean, that's not unique to Sweden. We've got the same in Anglo-Saxon England, They do have their own systems of unions, but we're not too sure how that worked. So it could very well be that all these different unions were seen as equal. And then when it comes to choosing like your favorite son or whatever, it might be like, well, your mom was of higher status or your mom was cleverer or, this kind of criteria. But it's not set in stone, definitely not. Which makes it very messy then, because so many things can happen. So many things, so many combinations. And that's what we see throughout the early medieval period, really. Brothers infighting. I mean, that's quite common everywhere, to be honest. But because everyone could really hope to become the next leader, it does, well, you do end up in situations that are all fairly unique. And Sweden being so late in adopting Christianity and continental standards compared to the rest of Northern Europe is quite unique in that regard. Then we actually have sources, talking about these systems of kinship and everything. So it's quite an interesting situation, really. Yeah.
And when time starts to pass and Sweden starts to adopt Christianity more broadly, and there starts to be like weddings in the legal sense, the canon law sense, like you're talking about, they are still reaching across to other places. So maybe not kidnapping as much, even though that still seems to be a thing, but reaching out to other countries to find queens. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book is like this foreignness is almost legitimizing in itself, right? Can you tell us about how that works?
So there is research being done on this, not by me. So it's a very exciting field of study. Yeah, you always have that idea that having a foreign queen is actually a very good thing. So when you look at like the 10th century, it seems to be more of a religious thing. I mean, obviously, all these places were far away, it was hard to reach. Like, of course, the Vikings were very good sailors and everything, but it was still a trek to go to Poland and Russia or whatever. And there was that having a woman from such a faraway place kind of gave a bit of godly character to someone. Basically, it's like, oh, what a lad, but like 10 times. And obviously, these people look a little bit different. They speak a language. That is something I'm not talking at all about in the book because, there is a word limit. But these women come back, they're not dressed exactly the same. They look a bit different. They speak a different language. It's impressive to these people who actually believe in the gods and everything. It's quite something. So it seems that we've got some mythological ideas and concepts kind of getting mixed into the reality there. And it's also a way for the king to kind of keep a distance with his subjects by not choosing someone who's too close. It's like, I'm a little bit different. We are different. We're not quite like you. And that's actually something that you get with the aristocracy later on, kind of keeping it within the caste. So that's for the 10th century. Then later on, so most of the queens in that book are actually foreign queens, which is maybe not that unique in terms of if you look at Europe in general, but it's quite pronounced in Sweden still, because it really is most of them. And that is for political reasons and diplomatic reasons and economic ones, because Sweden was so far behind in terms of things like their agricultural system or these kind of things. They were really quite late, partly because they were kind of far away from everyone and because of the climate and all these things, So marrying women from these countries, which are much more developed, is a great thing because then you can basically just appropriate their wealth and their success and their pedigrees and all of that. So it is prestigious. And it's kind of a way of saying, hey, look, I am very much part of Europe and European aristocracy. We're popular abroad and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is a bit of a contrast to the rest of Europe, where sometimes foreign queens, they're not looked at as being all that worthy because they're different. Like there's more of a xenophobic aspect to the way people are looking at these queens. And in Sweden, at least the examples that you have here, it's more like this is a great status symbol to have a queen from somewhere else. And so that is something special to Sweden, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're looking at queens at the same time, like in France and in England, many of them were properly bullied and rejected by their subjects because they're precisely not from here and were being led and ruled by someone who's not even from here. Whereas in Sweden, it's completely different. And because these Swedish leaders, the male leaders, are kind of like, it's a nascent aristocracy. They don't really have big names in their family lines or anything. They're literally just local guys who managed to get power. And they need these women to kind of justify their being in power and legitimize their line. But that in turn gives a lot of power to these women because then they know that without them, the guys can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a theme that kind of runs through the entire book, really, that quite a lot of these women actually had a lot of power without doing anything by virtue of having a big name. It's quite obvious, especially when you get to the 13th century with, all these women who come from Holstein, for example, or Mecklenburg, which are really big, powerful dynasties at the time. You don't mess with them, And if you're married to a daughter of Holstein, you've got to stay in your line because her daddy is much more powerful than the whole Sweden combined, and you don't want to anger him. And I do think that is quite unique to Sweden, and also because the legal system supports it as well. The legal system in Sweden is quite generous towards women, especially if you compare with Norway, which is right next door, and it's a completely different ballgame. Different factors just leads to Swedish women just having more power in general.
It's one of those strange situations. But the example that popped into my head is Roman gladiators, right? Where they're super like powerful in terms of their social cachet, but at the same time, they don't have a lot of power. So it's one of those examples from history or from human species, exactly, where you have somebody who's really powerful and also not at the same time. So it's an interesting combination of factors. I think this idea of being a super powerful, super pedigreed queen. At the same time, people barely remember your name in the sources, I
mean, it's terrible. I barely remember their names, and I wrote the book. But yeah, no, you're right. And I do think it's quite representative of the whole of the Middle Ages in general. It's a lot of posturing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Precisely because the state is not crystallized yet. You don't have those big administrations yet. So there's quite a lot, it's quite fluid still. And there's quite a lot of movements between the different social classes as well, actually, because it's elective.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just kingship that is elective. You also have like all the lower ranks and low speakers and these kind of people, local things.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is elective. So you do have quite a lot of movement between these different classes and everything. So yes, you could very much be a really big thing one day, and then the next you're gone. And I think they were really acutely aware of that as well.
Well, one of the other things I think is unique, or it seems unique to me, and maybe it's not, but it seems to have been fairly unique to Sweden in that nobody really cared if these women had had many children or many marriages beforehand. That didn't disqualify them from queenship, where when you see other countries at the same time, they're like, we get this betrothal happening at 3 years old to make sure that this woman has no other husbands, right? She is reserved for this king. Yeah. Whereas in your research, you see that there's women who have been married to like 3 different kings and they have children all over the place. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about this and the attitudes towards women who have been widowed or even divorced and becoming queen.
Again, I would say it's got a lot to do with Christianity, because all of these ideas about virginity and all that, of course, there is a political reason for it. As you say, we need to make sure that it's definitely his baby. But you also have these religious reasons for wanting women to be pure and all that. And because Sweden is so late in adopting this kind of new codes and this new worldview, it does take quite a while before it becomes a really important factor in choosing a wife. So the 3-year-old thing, you start seeing that in the 14th century. And the very last woman that I'm talking about in the book was promised when she was like 1, something like that. Mm-hmm. And by the time she was like 10, she had had 2 different fiancés or whatever. I don't even remember. It was disgusting. But yeah, it's true that throughout the previous centuries, it just doesn't matter whether you've had kids. If anything, it's a good thing because, it shows that you can have kids and that you can survive childbirth, mm-hmm. which is, actually quite a big thing. If you've had 5 kids, probably you can have a 6th one. And the fact that you're older doesn't seem to be a problem either, because basically they're so desperate. Let's face it. These guys were absolutely desperate because they didn't have any claim to anything really. And they just want women who have experience of ruling and, who can actually speak for themselves. It's quite important diplomatically and everything. So it's actually seen as quite a good thing if that woman has experience. And yeah, we do have a few examples, like Ulfhild, for example, who was married a bunch of times to different kings from different places. She's very much a career queen, what I call a career queen, because some of them kind of fell into that and clearly didn't really want it or didn't care. But she's looking for it, She loses the first husband and she goes to get another one and another one. And, at this point, it's a choice. She's actually choosing. Because by the end of it, she's like 40 something and she's still looking for power and these positions. And so it's basically a job. And I think that's how many of them saw it, as a job. So from that perspective, they were quite ahead of their time, actually, in a way.
Yeah. A certain understanding of what they bring to the table, right? Yeah. Like a certain confidence in the fact that their pedigree is worth something. They've been around Europe enough to understand that they have this political experience that's going to be so important. So, good for her. She married, I think, 3 different kings. Yep, and career queen.
And I mean, let's face it, most of these women who are like in their 30s and one may have been in her 50s, if the sources are correct, they're not going to get married to the up-and-coming 15-year-old prince, right? Mm-hmm. They are towards the end of their career and of their lives, generally speaking, for the Middle Ages. So it's also a way for them to stay relevant and to still enjoy a very nice lifestyle and everything. And so, as I said, all these Swedish men, many of them came from kind of obscurity. Like, for example, Sverker the First, not too sure where he comes from. And he's a really big king and it became a really big dynasty, but not too sure how he made it. And so these guys can't possibly dream of marrying an up-and-coming 20-year-old princess from Holstein. Like, they wouldn't look at them. Absolutely wouldn't. So it's very beneficial for everyone. And I think that's quite an important point here, actually, that a lot of these unions were beneficial for the women as well, at least in the first part of the book. And once these Swedish men have established themselves, their names and their dynasties, and they've got power and they start having castles and everything and lots of land, then they can start getting peakier. And that's when you start seeing women get younger and younger. And basically the last one, she was a baby.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think maybe part of this as well is that there isn't that established tradition of having places for women to go. And that, like, if you're a widowed queen in lots of other places, you end up in a nunnery, right? You end up in a convent, but they don't have a huge number of convents in Sweden at this moment either. So you could pick a good one, but it might be beneficial to just stay out of the convent, depending on your personality and what's available.
I mean, most of them do end up dying in the convent, but like really towards the end. I'm trying to think of any example of anyone who just called it quits really quick, but I don't think so. Yeah, I think, the convent was like really the retirement bit, the very end. And you didn't have many of them, so usually you just died in the convent you had founded, basically. But I do think the whole culture of staying in a nunnery and everything, obviously elsewhere in Europe, it had been a thing for quite a long time. Obviously, monasticism was much more developed and had been for hundreds of years. In Sweden, basically, you don't really have monastic institutions until the Cistercians show up in the 12th century. It's so late. I mean, I really do want to emphasize that. It is super late compared to the rest of Europe. We're like 400 years behind, which does kind of lead to some really odd situations by contemporary standards. But women seem to have remained very active. And we do have examples like Hedwig of Holstein, who seems to be still active in politics, or at least in the management of her grandson's affairs or something, until she dies, basically. And she dies very old, actually. And that's just based on the sources we've got surviving, and most of them for Sweden are gone. So it could be that a lot more of these women were actually working behind the scenes and we just have no idea.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wouldn't have realized before reading your book is that there were 2 royal archives of all sorts of information and they both burned, both in 2 different cities. So
it's 300 years apart or so. Yeah, and that's why a lot of people don't like doing early medieval Swedish history, because we're kind of always reusing the exact same sources, because you can't just invent a source that doesn't exist anymore.
But what a tragedy.
I know, right? I know. Yeah, for our listeners, that's the first fire is the Tre Kronor castle in Stockholm that just goes up in flames with everything in it. And then the copies in Turku in Finland, the big fire in Turku, which kind of destroyed the city. And that's where we are. And that's also why we have to rely so much on foreign sources, things that were kept elsewhere. Simple as that.
Well, that's the thing. Like, they're like, let's keep the archive in Finland. It'll be safe there. It's not safe there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's quite a common thing for archives to burn down. But there was a lot of papers at once, twice. So that's why our knowledge is very patchy as well. And I'm under no illusions. I don't think there's much more to find about these queens than what I've got in the book, because it's based on what lots of people have done before and what I've done for like a couple of years, my own research. You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of great new stuff in Swedish sources. If there's anything else, it's going to be abroad. And there is like a lot of potential for further research in places like Poland. Well, Ukraine is a bit complicated at the moment for obvious reasons. But before the war, there were people starting to look into those archives as well, which have not been very well studied. So I mean, there is potential to find exciting stuff elsewhere. But in Sweden, not so much.
Well, one case example is the first example that you have in the book. The first queen that you can find might be several people. It might be real and might not be. So tell us about this queen.
Sigrid. Sigrid Storråda, which is one of the most famous medieval queens in Sweden, because of all these really cool stories about her and how she slapped Olaf Tryggvason and how she didn't care what anyone thought, and she was burning down buildings and killing suitors because she didn't want to be bothered, talking to them. And all of the sources we've got talking about Sigrid or later by at least a couple of 100 years, and they're all contradictory. So she must have existed, as in, obviously, Eric the Victorious had a wife. We know that. He's considered the first historically accurate, or attested at least, king of Sweden. He obviously had a wife. The sources tell us that is Sigrid. So sure, from that perspective, she existed. Now, who was she exactly? Everyone seems to agree she was Polish. The different sources do agree that she came from the East, that she was related to Mieszko of Poland. Now, was she a daughter? Was she a sister? That is not too clear, but it seems to be, from that family. What did she actually do during her life? How many people did she actually kill? Was she really that nasty? That's a bit up in the air. We do have some fairly close sources from the early 11th century, so it's fairly close, because she's 10th century, being rather neutral about her, saying, yeah, okay, she had a mind of her own, but, it's not that bad. It's more in the 13th century that she gets that reputation of being really horrible. And obviously, by that point, everyone is Christian. And obviously, she was a pagan. And, if you want to discredit pagan people and pagan ideas, you're going to either emphasize the bad stuff that people did or actually invent it completely. So if you're reading Heimskringla or the sagas, you'll see lots of horrible things about Sigrid. We don't know if it's true. We have no evidence for it. I personally doubt that she could go around killing kings and people like that without any consequences. I do think someone would have eventually stopped her. That's just my own personal opinion. But she is absolutely fantastic. She's really fun to study, partly because it's so complicated and kind of goes in all directions, and you can really have fun with the theories. But also because she really became a symbol of what a pagan woman is, what a Viking woman is, even though she wasn't a Viking per se, but, she's from that time period. And she's been used as a character in novels, in poems, in art. And I think she's also very fit for the modern age, because a lot of the things that she's accused of in the sources, we would just think is quite normal today, like being allowed to say no to a man, or, being allowed to defend your beliefs or your religion or these kind of things. So funnily enough, even though she is the earliest queen, she's the most relevant one, I think, to today's women. So, yeah.
It's funny because what you're saying is that the way that she's relevant to us is the way that she was totally vilified by the monks writing about her, which is funny because if they're coming up with just ideas to make her sound bad, like to us, we're like, well, that sounds pretty good to me. And it's going totally against what their mission was, which was to make you really hate her.
Yeah, literally. It's quite funny, isn't it? And I do think throughout history that's part of the reason why she's always been so popular. Because, people were not that stupid. They could also read through what the monks were. It's not just us reading through what the monks were writing. I think it's quite important to remember that our ancestors also had brains and they also could understand propaganda. But yeah, no, she's quite a fun character and she's very enigmatic, like everyone else really at that time. And she does seem to have been very strong. So yeah, she's a fun one.
Well, speaking of queens and monks, one of the things that you mentioned that sort of in some ways consolidates the power of these queens is that they invite monks and they start to found monasteries. So can you tell us a little bit about how that developed?
So basically, throughout Europe, it's not just Sweden. You usually have quite a strong relationship between monastic institutions and just religious institutions in general, so churches and all that, and the aristocracy. So basically, it's a beneficial relationship, right? The local landowners will give you land to build your church on, your monastery or whatever, and give you protection from raiders or whatever. And in exchange, you'll get the political support from that institution, from the monks. And obviously, in fully Christianized countries, until very recently, the clergy had a lot of power and, a lot of clout. So if you are being supported officially by that abbey or whatever, it is very prestigious. So we start seeing that develop in the 12th century. Basically, like it starts in the very, very last few years of the 11th century. And it seems to be a woman, who completely kickstart the trend. Again, these are women who come from Norway, mainly at that time. And they have seen that happen. Monasticism spreading elsewhere in Europe. They know how it works. They've witnessed it. They've witnessed the power of having good relationships with the clergy. So it very much seems to be like women who actually brought in the monks. We've got that in the sources. Urhild in particular was very active in that regard. And they seem to be the one kind of serving as a link between the local strongman and the clergy and the people as well, kind of working as intercessors in a way and smoothing relationships and everything. And that made them extremely important. And that becomes a defining feature of queenship in Sweden. Queens are expected, or, noble women in general, are expected to support ecclesiastical institutions. So they usually have a favorite one, either one that they actually founded themselves, or one that is local to them, or the one where they were educated, or this kind of stuff, But usually you give them money or land or this kind of stuff, which you can take back, by the way. It's usually not a perpetual gift. It's kind of more of a loan. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Because we get that in the 12th century. We do get a couple of legal cases that are quite interesting, where they're kind of like, hey, remember, we were just lending you the land and we want it back. So can you please leave? And it's like, no, we're not leaving. And eventually the monks had to leave and start a new monastery. So that is quite an important cornerstone, really, of the development of the Swedish state and aristocracy and all that. And the church really does start playing a very important role in Swedish politics from the mid-12th century onwards. So much so that you really can't understand how Sweden became a kingdom without understanding what was going on behind the scenes with the church and the Pope and all of that. But I think that's probably quite true of a lot of different countries. It's just very clear in Sweden because they didn't have a native aristocracy in the same way as other continental countries inherited the Roman system. So the church kind of had a bit more room to play with because there was kind of nothing, when they arrived. I don't really quite like saying that because, of course, Sweden had its own elite, its own social classes and everything, but it was a lot less developed than elsewhere. So they had a lot more room to navigate that landscape and kind of, install themselves, really.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you mentioned in the book is that this is the perfect role for women because they are being told that they're supposed to be intercessors and bring things together. And so this is tailor-made and probably great for everyone, where they're like, well, she can do it. She can be our intercessor. Because then we can all keep our reputations intact. We can save face if things start to go south.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And obviously, there's a link here with the idea that the Virgin Mary is the middle person between Jesus and people and between God and people. That's an idea that really starts spreading during that period in the Middle Ages. And I think there's that kind of universal thing that women are not seen as threatening, compared to men. They're not going around with a big sword, that kind of stuff. So obviously, they're actually more approachable. They're expected to be women or at least maternal figures, so, kind of easier to talk to, which is also why it seems to be such a big deal when we've got a queen that is not particularly nice, like the wife of St. Eric, Christina, who doesn't seem to be, well, as per the standards of the time, doesn't seem to be a particularly nice person. Basically, all she did was stand her ground and say, hey, this is my land. I should be able to keep it. But she seems to have been pretty horrible about it, though, in the way she went about it. And I mean, it's fair, it's fine. Not all women are nice. No point in pretending that we're all angels. Some of them in the book really seem to have been horrible. That's fine. But that's also why it's such a big deal when that happens, because it really flies in the face of social expectations. Like with Sigrid, in a way. How dare you have an opinion and actually voice it, But yeah, no, it is a really good role. And again, it's quite beneficial for them. It makes them very important and very useful and relevant. It's important for women to play a role. Otherwise, you end up in those situations where it's like, oh, she can't have kids anymore. I'm just going to ditch her and take another one. It's not quite the case here because these women nurture these relationships with these monasteries and nunneries over their entire lifetimes. You need them as diplomatic intercessors. So yeah, it is a very important role in medieval society.
Yeah, make yourself so important that you can't be put aside.
Literally, yeah.
It's
absolutely.
smart. Well, I was thinking about the nasty women in this book, right? And the one that speaks to me is Marta, who, with her husband, they get captured and then they take some pretty brutal revenge later. And people are like, hey, wait a second. Why is she involved in this? This is not very maternal at all.
Yeah. Both sides did really horrible things in that situation. Don't want to spoil the book because it's kind of fun, but yeah, it's basically like, oh, you kept me in a dungeon. I'm going to keep you in a dungeon. I'm going to throw away the key. And it's just that over the course of 15 years. And I mean, it does have a really tragic ending. But I mean, these things were happening behind the scenes anyway. It's all about how you present, right? We know that they weren't all super nice people, and we know they were still very brutal. But It was a big deal at the time and in the chronicles and everything, because obviously now you've got Christianity. You're supposed to be gracious. You're supposed to be nice. You're not supposed to murder people, by the way. And they're just openly doing it. And it was a very public feud with the dukes, between the dukes and the king and his wife Märta. And again, I think it's that kind of clash between public image and what's actually happening. Because Märta's wedding was all about like, oh, look, I'm super nice. I'm going to free some prisoners and everything. And then she's just murdering and plotting her way to power. Then it really ends badly anyway. But I do think it's just about like PR. It's just PR and being confronted with reality. And reality is that it was still a very brutal time,
Yeah.
And religious was more of a political tool than I'm sure some people obviously believed, but we know thanks to literally the rest of history until today that, a lot of politics have to do with just PR. And so was she really that bad of a person? Well, an eye for an eye. She did a lot of bad stuff. A lot of bad stuff was done to her. And also, all we know of her is through chronicles written by friends of her enemies. So we've got to take it with a pinch of salt.
That makes a difference. Well,
yeah.
As we wrap up, I need to ask you, do you have a favorite? Is it Sigrid? Who's your favorite?
So I have two favorites, very first and very last. So yeah, Sigrid is amazing. Just because she's everyone and nobody at the same time. So you could kind of project so many things onto her, which is what people did. And also she's just so cool. And it's the Viking Age. Everyone loves the Vikings, right? Let's face it. No, I really do like Sigrid. And also because you've got all that kind of dynamics with Poland and all the raiding and everything. And it's still a time when they're like exploring Europe and everything. So you've got that going on in the background. So it's really nice. But I do like Ingeborg, the Duchess, the very last one, because her life was quite tragic. That's the one who was promised when she was like 1, and then again when she was 3, and she gets married very, very young, and he's very old compared to her. She's like 12, and he's 30 or whatever. And then he dies quite early as well, and she ends up a widow with 2 young kids at like 17. It's just really horrible. And somehow she ends up being the regent for both Norway and Sweden at 17, which is just insane. And it goes pretty badly as well, because obviously she's 17, so she makes lots of really stupid decisions. Let's face it. It's like cancelling debt for like an entire city or something. It's like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, of course it's going to backfire. But obviously she's got all these people around her who are giving her conflicting advice and trying to control her and manipulate her. And what is great with her as well is that because we are at that point in the 14th century, we actually have a fair amount of information about her, and not just from Swedish sources, which, as we said, kind of all burned down, but also from Norwegian sources, because of course she was regent there as well. And you can kind of see how that woman's life developed from being a child to when she died fairly old, and all the life phases and stages she went through and everything. And it's quite tragic, but it's just so interesting. But you've got to read the entire book to get to her life.
It's worth it. It's worth reading the entire book to get to her, because you have so much great research in here. And again, this is a gap that needed to be filled. So Thank you so much for writing the book so that we can all learn from it. And thank you for coming on the podcast and telling us all about Sweden's royal women.
Thanks for having me.
To find out more about Caroline's work, you can check out her profile on LinkedIn. Her new book is The Queens and Royal Women of Sweden, circa 970 to 1330, Their Lives, Power, and Legacy. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. And Peter, you're a little bit echoey today for an interesting reason. Why are you a little bit echoey today?
Indeed. Well, one of our social media people, Onyx, has decided to give birth to 3 kittens and has decided to use the recording studio we have.
Well, congratulations, Peter, on your 3 new kittens.
Thank you. I'm sure Onyx will be back at work very soon, and we'll put the 3 kittens at work too.
You give her a decent mat leave. Come on now. A cat mat leave. That's how it works, right?
Yep.
But in the meantime, you are still getting some stuff done for the website. What's happening?
So one of the things I like to research is like the nitty-gritty of medieval sources. And this week we did a report on a recent study of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So historian Tom Lysons took a close look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, especially between the years 1062 to 66, which is kind of an important period. So what he found was that the chronicles got edited, the versions that we have got edited kind of selectively in the years after, and they're all done in a way that actually would make Harold Godwinson look better for his claim to the English throne.
Oh, that is shocking. Shocking editing history in the aftermath of events.
Indeed, indeed. So it was a pretty cool article. It's important to look at the silences in the chronicles, especially this one, because they really do leave out a lot of stuff.
Well, people will have to check that one out. What else have you got for us?
So with a new pope about to be picked, we're doing a lot of medieval papacy stuff. And so we have our list of the top 10 anti-popes.
Whoa, we were just talking about anti-popes last week when we were talking about Frederick Barbarossa. So I wonder if the anti-popes from that period are going to end up on your list.
A couple do. So there's plenty of an anti-pope out there. So having fun.
Excellent. And as we're recording this, everyone is gearing up for the biggest medieval conference in North America, right?
Indeed, the International Congress on Medieval Studies, Kalamazoo, as we call it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not too late for people to attend, especially if you want to attend virtually. You can sign up. And I know the sessions we get recorded so that even if you don't want to attend live, you can see them for like the rest of the month.
Yes, excellent. It's a good option for a lot of us who are staying home this year. We can still attend virtually. I think both of us are going to be doing that, right?
Indeed. It'll be fun.
So for the people who are listening to this right at the beginning of the conference, we will see you there. And thanks for stopping by, Peter, and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
With all the many podcasts out there on the airwaves today, I have to say that it's especially meaningful to me that you and I get to spend this time together nerding out about the Middle Ages every week. It's your support that makes this possible. So thank you for letting those ads roll through, for sharing your favorite episodes, and for becoming patrons on patreon.com. This week, there are over 70 open access articles representing the latest news in medieval studies listed just for patrons, as well as much, much more. To get in on all the sweet medieval action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Swedes to bead, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening and have yourself an amazing day.